So the Purrely deck was introduced to the game in Amazing Defenders, but took all the way until Cyberstorm Access to finally become good in the OCG. The goal of this video is to be as informative as possible, so regardless of the amount of knowledge you have on this deck, you can take something away from it. By the end of this video, you should know how this deck operates, how it is built, and also how to stop it. Alright, so first of all, Purrely is an Xyz-based strategy that pretty much almost never really Xyz summons. I mean, it does, but in a really weird way. For example, you're never Xyz summoning your rank 2 Purrely Xyz monsters by using 2 level 2 Xyz monsters. You're rather cheating them out, but at the same time, you cheat them out by properly summoning them with one single monster. And there are barely any of these main deck Purrely monsters. There's only 2 of them actually. On the other hand, this deck plays a lot of spell cards that, very similarly to Sky Striker Hornet in the Sky Striker deck, can actually get your stuff going. So these Purrely quickly spell cards don't really summon a token like Hornet Jones does, but instead, it actually summons your level 1 Purrely monsters from the deck, and they do whatever you want. So yeah, if Runic and Zodiac could have a baby, this would probably be it. The difference with Runic is that your quickly spell cards aren't summoning a monster from your extra deck, but rather from your main deck. And unlike Zodiac, you're not really ending your turn on a big-ass Zeus, but rather on a big-ass Purrely Noir. Try to take like 5 seconds to read this card, it's completely broken. Oh, and this deck is extremely xenophobic because you're not really trying to play like other engines in this deck. You really have to play it pure because you have to dedicate so many slots to your deck to playing the Purrely cards. And like I said, this deck only plays 2 built-in monsters for the archetype, which are the 2 level 1 Purrely monsters, 4 quickly spell cards, 1 continuous spell, 1 field spell, and 1 trap card. And similarly to Adamancipator, this deck does a lot of excavating, but you can only add excavated Purrely cards, so the more you play, the merrier. That's one of the main reasons why pretty much every single Purrely card is being played at 3 in the main deck. Speaking of which, let's dive right into these cards. As I said, there's 2 main deck monsters. The first one is a Purrely, and the second one is a Purrely Lily. So Purrely is an extremely interesting card that, upon normal or special summon, can excavate the top 3 cards from your deck and add any Purrely card excavated. That is not once per turn, so excavating 9 cards and adding 3 cards definitely can happen. It also has a second effect to cheat out one of your rank 2 Purrely Xyz monsters from your extra deck by revealing and attaching one of your Purrely quickly spells from your hand that is listed in the card text of that Purrely Xyz. Now, Purrely Lily is very similar, but at the same time very different. So unlike Purrely, Purrely Lily's effects are both hard once per turns. And also on the summon, you get to search any non-quickly spell card Purrely card from your deck to your hand. And instead of having to reveal that quickly spell from your hand, you actually target it in your graveyard, which is actually way better in a simplified game state. Now, before we jump into the Xyz monsters, let's take a look at the quickly spell cards first. There are 4 of them, and they're all connected to an evolution of Purrely. However, at the current moment, only 3 of the quickly spell cards can summon the Xyz monsters because the 4th one is only getting released in Duelist Nexus. Every single Purrely quickly spell card shares the same effect of allowing you to discard a card from your hand in order to special summon a level 1 Purrely monster from your deck. Do take note that the discard to special summon is optional, so you really don't have to do it if you don't want to, and also the discard is not a cost but rather a part of the effect. So this makes these cards really good in tandem with Shuttle Beast and Brow. And also, these quickly spell cards grant your Xyz monsters additional effects when they're used underneath as Xyz materials. Sleepy Memory makes your Xyz monster draw you a card on your opponent's standby phase. Pretty Memory can give your monster an ignition effect that allows you to send a card you control to the graveyard to attach a card your opponent controls underneath it as an Xyz material. Delicious Memory gives your Xyz monster 300 attack and defense for each of your Xyz materials. And finally, Happy Memory allows your Xyz monster to attack on monsters your opponent controls up to the amount of Happy Memories under +1. What you need to know first and foremost is that none of the effects that I just described are hard once per turns. So in other words, if you have 3 Sleepy Memories underneath your Xyz monster, you will be drawing 3 cards. And if you have 3 copies of Delicious Memory underneath your Xyz, you will be getting 900 attack and defense for each material. Because of how these extra effects stack, you can easily end up with a gigantic Xyz monster that can attack like 4 times, draw you 3 cards, and break boards. However, I also need to say that Sleepy Memory and Pretty Memory are the only quickly spell cards that can be used on an empty board. Delicious Memory can only be used while there is a monster on the field, and then Happy Memory can only be used when there is any other card on the field. With that being said, this deck is very consistent, especially with all the 1-card plays that you have. Now, how about the other support cards? My Friend Purrely is a continuous spell card with an effect very similar to the Link 2 Purrely monster. You can always search the card that you want by revealing 3 copies of it, just like how Monarchs used to do with Pantheism. And it also has an effect that allows you to recycle back up to 3 purely quickly spell cards from your graveyard to your hand whenever your Purrely Xyz monster leaves the field because of an opponent's card. I said because of an opponent's card, not necessarily battle or card effects, so you can get Kaiju'd and still recycle 3 cards. And because of that, Kaijus and Santa Claus and Kurikara are unfortunately a little less good against this deck. Now, the field spell is very similar, but it doesn't really get anything started. It only protects your Purrely monsters from being targeted the turn they were special summoned, and also has a very similar effect with the recursion whenever your Purrely Xyz monster leaves the field because of an opponent's card effect. You won't be recycling back 3 cards from your graveyard to your hand, but you will be summoning a level 1 Purrely from your deck or graveyard to the field. And finally, on the end phase, you can attach any Purrely quickly spell card from your deck or graveyard to your Xyz monster. So this is really good at allowing you to farm more Sleepy Memories underneath your Xyz so that you can draw a bunch of cards on your opponent's turn. Alright, now it's time to move into the Xyz monsters. Like I said before, currently there are only 3 rank 2 Xyz monsters for the deck, and you can't really summon them using 2 monsters. So you have to cheat them out by using the effects of your Purrely main deck monsters, either by revealing a Purrely quickly spell in your hand, or by targeting one in your graveyard. So the targets that currently exist are Purrely Beauty, Happiness, as well as Plump. They have a very intuitive name and are all correlated to the quickly spell card that summons them. So try to look at it that way. If Purrely eats a delicious meal, she becomes plump. And then if Purrely does the opposite of what Yu-Gi-Oh! Player does and actually cleans herself, she becomes beauty. And then if Purrely plays with her ball, she becomes happy. Again, if you played Pokemon before, you can compare the evolutions to these Xyz monsters. Depending on the stone that you're giving your Eevee, she will transform into another evolution. Let's start with the most powerful rank 2 monster that you can play in this deck, and that would be Plump, which is typically played at 2 copies of in every single extra deck. This card allows you to attach up to 2 spells and traps from either player's graveyard to it as Xyz materials. And this does matter because the more materials your Xyz monsters have, the faster you can go into Purrely Noir. And then these effects become quick effects when you have their own memories attached underneath as materials, but that's obviously a given. Now this is where it becomes unfair. Up to thrice per turn. Thrice, I love that word. It almost makes me feel smart. Emphasis on almost. But yeah, up to thrice per turn, when you activate a Purrely quickly spell card, you can attach it as Xyz material and then banish any monster on the field until the end phase. Literally Farfa multiplied by 3. Now for the less good rank 2 Xyz monsters. They're still needed and you still have to play them, but they're just utility toolboxes, so you only really play one of each. Purrely Beauty, I want to say, is probably the second best because it has a nice effect Veiler-esque effect. And just like Plump, it also has a thrice per turn effect, but instead of banishing a monster, you're only changing the battle position of a monster on the field. But Mom, I want enemy controller! Honey, we already have enemy controller at home. And last, but also least, is Happiness. This card is dog shit, or rather should I say, cat piss. At the end of the damage step, if this card battles, you can search a Purrely card from your deck to your hand. That's probably never gonna happen. I'm not gonna lie though, its thrice per turn effect is actually not too bad because you can bounce back a spell or trap card your opponent controls to the hand when you activate a Purrely quickly spell card. So it can interrupt cards like continuous spell cards or field spells or back row decks, but that's pretty much all it really does. I guess it's not too bad against the super heavy Samurai Pendulum monster. But summoning this card generically might not necessarily be the best idea. Beauty, at the very least, can prevent your opponent from straight up killing you by negating stuff and also preventing your opponent from going into a Zeus. Either way though, if you have to end your turn on a Purrely Xyz monster that isn't Purrely Noir, Plump is always the better option. But yeah, speaking of Noir, granted your little kitties have 5 or more materials, you can slap that giant pussy on top. Words taken out of context, I know. You can technically also make Happiness, but that card actually sucks ass, so yeah, forget about it. It has like a shitty Dark Ruler No More effect, and it can burn damage when it battles, but nobody cares. Purrely Noir, on the other hand, is insane. While you have 5 or more materials, it is unaffected by your opponent's activated effects. This means that it loses to Baguska and Skill Drain, but that's another story for another day. Also, it conveniently has a non-once per turn Phoenix Wing Wind Blast-esque effect that actually returns back to the bottom instead of the top. And it's any card your opponent controls or in their graveyard, and of course, it's a quick effect. Granted, you have a level 1 Purrely monster as an Xyz material. And unless you're really stupid, this should always be the case. If you can summon this card with 7 materials, you're in a really good position because you can use the effect once and then it still has 5 and it doesn't lose to like Dark Ruler and stuff. You always want to max out the amount of Sleepy Memories underneath as well so that you can drop wards 3 cards on your opponent's standby phase and dig for hand traps. Now, by the way, speaking of hand traps, the OCG has max C, so it makes sense that they play a lot of hand traps, but in the TCG, we don't really have that. So that kind of means that you are presented with your very first dilemma. Should you run Board Breakers or Hand Traps in the Purrely deck? Well, of course, if you play Board Breakers and you draw into them on your opponent's turn, they don't really help you survive. And unfortunately, Hand Traps really turn on cards like Triple Tactic Talents and Tasking, which I don't really know if you really want, and Ash doesn't really do anything against Purrely. I think that's kind of obvious, but if you Ash a Purrely Quickly spell card, your opponent only really commits one card, and he can just use another one right after. If you want to play Hand Traps, I guess you can still choose to play the 3 Ash and potentially 3 Jewels for the Super Heavy Samurai matchup. You can also play 1 DD Crow because it's searchable by Lyrilusk Recital Starling, which can be made using 2 level 1 Purrely main deck monsters. Or you can play really obscure cards like Danger Bigfoot and the Ishizu Shufflers in order to have more triggers in the graveyard when you discard them with your quick play spell cards. Anyways, the final Purrely card is a trap card, not super relevant, and it's Purrely Leap. Basically, it transforms your Purrely Xyz monster into an Xyz monster with a different rank. It also has like a very budget effect of Daigusto Emerald, where it shuffles back 3 of your engraved Purrely monsters into the deck, but you don't draw a card. Now, the main key to playing Purrely is resource management, but also configuration of your Xyz monsters. You want some nicely stacked up Purrely Noir, or at the very least, some big-ass plumps. Even a very weak hand should still be able to end on maybe 2 to 3 interruptions at the very least. And this deck also has access to really good field spells because Bridge of Salvation can just conveniently happen to search any of them. So if you have a quick play spell card, you can discard the Bridge of Salvation and then banish it to search both Cobalt Eagle, which is just another discard fodder, as well as Secret Village of the Spellcasters. Now you might be thinking, but Yaksign, your Purrely monsters are fairies, how the hell are you gonna turn on your own Secret Village? Well, you can just turn your Purrely monsters into Relinquished Anima and that's it. Oh, and by the way, Secret Village also takes care of pretty much every single board breaker typically used against you. The best board breaker against the deck would definitely have to be Herald of the Abyss. Because of the fact that you're not directly trying to send a monster upon controls to the grave, but rather making your opponent send their own monster, you bypass a lot of annoying effects. So obviously this card allows you to clear monsters that are unaffected by card effects, but also bypasses the continuous spell card and the field spell. And that is exactly why the 2019 World Champion Kuki Kosaka chose to play 3 copies of Triple Tactic Thrust as well as 1 Herald of the Abyss in the main deck. So if you want to beat the deck, you have to make sure that they cannot recur back anything with the continuous spell card and the field spell. And if you want to win with the deck, you need to make sure that you always turbo out these cards as well as Purrely Noir or Plump. Anyways, with that being said, that's pretty much all I had to showcase for this video. Guys, let me know if you want more videos like these because I'm always down to make them. It's really fun to make. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys very soon. Peace.